Lucy, and I'm doing some fieldwork in education for Professor Sember this semester. We're actually here today right at the Lincoln Memorial, and we are going to be talking to you guys about the 15th Amendment and voting rights tests.
As Sarah said, we're going to be talking about the 15th Amendment and the voting rights test. Now, to give you a little bit of context about this, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, known as the Civil War Amendments, were added to the Constitution after the Civil War ended. Everybody knows the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 15th Amendment was supposed to guarantee voting rights to the newly freed slaves. With this said, however, it actually doesn't guarantee these rights.
So, how would you write the 15th Amendment? How would you give the freedmen the right to vote? In my opinion, I would just put it straightforward. The newly freedmen have the right to vote. But that's not the way the 15th Amendment was written.
So what exactly does the 15th Amendment say? The 15th Amendment says the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, the key words in this are actually the words shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, if you notice, when Sarah was given the common sense definition, the common sense amendment, she said the right to vote, the freedmen shall have the right to vote. Well, think about this. The 15th Amendment does not say that at all. Instead of guaranteeing people the right to vote, it actually lists the conditions under which you cannot deny them the right to vote. So in theory, as long as race, color, or previous condition of servitude is not involved, that means that you can actually stop somebody from voting using the 15th Amendment.
So, have you ever gone to a fair and guessed how many jelly beans were in a jar? Believe it or not, this was the basis of one of the voting rights tests. When you went to vote, they would ask you how many jelly beans were in a jar. And if they wanted you to vote, they would tell you you had the number right. But if they didn't want you to vote, they would tell you you had the number wrong. Now, let's think about this. They're not denying you the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. They're denying you the right to vote on the basis of the number of jelly beans in a jar.
A second way to skirt the 15th Amendment dealing with voting rights was actually the poll tax. Quite simply put, if you could pay the tax, you would be allowed the right to vote. And if in fact you could not pay the tax, then guess what? You would be denied the right to vote. This was designed to not only limit the voting rights for the newly freedmen, but also for poor whites as well. This was also denying people the right to vote, but not on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but on their ability to pay the poll tax. This was perfectly legal under the 15th Amendment.
Another voting rights test was the soap bubble test. Now, let's think about this. They wanted to ask you how many bubbles were in a bar of soap. Who knows how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? They didn't even know how many bubbles were in a bar of soap. But if they wanted you to vote, they would tell you that you had it right. And if they didn't want you to vote, they would tell you that you had it wrong. And this was perfectly legal under the 15th Amendment.
The grandfather clause was another way to skirt the 15th Amendment dealing with voting rights. Quite simply put, if your grandfather could vote, then you would be allowed to vote. Now think about this. The slaves were not going to have grandfathers that had the right to vote because they were slaves. What we forget oftentimes is that there were a lot of poor white folks as well whose grandfathers were not allowed the right to vote, and in fact they too were going to be denied. This was perfectly legal under the 15th Amendment.
Another way of getting around the 15th Amendment were the literacy tests. And what they were going to do was they were going to give you a passage or a series of questions. And if they wanted you to vote, they were going to give you something that was a bit more simple. And if they didn't want you to vote, they were going to give you something more complicated. Now, if we think about this, many of the slaves and the poor whites were uneducated. And the literacy tests were going to deny them the right to vote. And this was perfectly legal under the 15th Amendment.
All right, so let's sum all this up. If they would have written the 15th Amendment so that it simply said the freedmen shall have the right to vote, think about all these tests that we've discussed. It doesn't matter if it was the poll tax, the soap bubble test, the literacy test, the grandfather clause, or the jelly bean test. None of these would have prevented the newly freedmen or poor whites from being able to vote. But they didn't write the 15th Amendment that way. Instead of guaranteeing the right to vote, they gave you conditions under which you could not deny the right to vote. And since all of these tests that we've discussed had nothing to do with race, color, or previous condition of servitude, all of these were legal ways to deny people the right to vote.